It has been almost 1.5 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. Can you believe that? Folks, time flies. Well, not for Ukrainians, who have endured 16 long months of bloodshed, death, and destruction. A lot has happened since the war began, with the latest development being Russia's ending the grain deal. Here are my thoughts about Russia's move. Where it all began. It was on February 24, 2022, when we awoke to the news that Russia had invaded Ukraine. As you might know, the world today is full of conflicts. Some wars are as intense and persistent as the anticyclonic storm on Jupiter. Virtually every part of the world is currently experiencing conflict. Europe had been among the few exceptions until Russia began an all-out invasion of Ukraine. The military action seemed to catch European leaders by surprise, despite repeated American warnings of the looming invasion. The pessimism of European leaders is understandable.
After days on a razor's edge, Ukraine is now a nation at war. President Vladimir Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
The United States had been right. Indeed, Russia had been planning to invade its European neighbor. What American generals underestimated was the resilience of Ukrainians. They had predicted that Kyiv would fall within 72 hours. Do you think Americans believed Russia would overrun Ukraine in a matter of days? Was it a plan to trap the Russians in a catastrophic war they couldn't win? We might not know for sure. With no doubt, Putin did the unthinkable by bringing war to Europe. The battle is still raging with no conceivable end, and it is hard to predict who will emerge victorious. A lot has happened since the start of the war. The West has imposed harsh sanctions on Russia. NATO has extended its border with Russia after Finland and Sweden joined the military bloc. The two countries had long maintained neutrality, but Putin's war forced them to change their minds. One of the reasons Russia invaded Ukraine was to prevent further NATO expansion closer to its border.
What does Vladimir Putin want? For NATO to stop expanding. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance. These countries are the founding members of NATO. These countries joined it during the Cold War, and these countries joined after it. Ukraine wants to join NATO too, but Putin wants NATO to exclude Ukraine and every former Soviet state.
However, the invasion has achieved the exact opposite. Now call that shooting yourself in the foot. Ouch. The deal to allow the exportation of Ukrainian grains. One consequence of the war was a blockade of Ukrainian exports through the Black Sea. Before the invasion, almost 37% of all Ukrainian agricultural exports passed through the Black Sea. Unbeknownst to many, Ukrainian food exports played a critical role in global food security. That is why political leaders blame the rising cost of living on the war in Ukraine. After months of military blockade and intense negotiations, the UN succeeded in brokering a deal between the two warring countries to facilitate the exportation of Ukraine's agricultural produce. The deal, which took effect on July 22, 2022, gave safe passage to Ukrainian ships carrying grain across the Black Sea. The term of the agreement would come to an end after 120 days. Ukrainian agricultural exports have since soured to almost reach pre-invasion levels. The deal has stabilized food prices worldwide, alleviating the suffering the world had been facing. It was a breath of fresh air we had longed for amid the shocking war. The deal itself was a surprise. It was hard to fathom how a country that invades another without justification would act in good faith. Our suspicions about Moscow's intentions have been proven right with the unilateral action to nix the agreement. On July 17, 2023, Russia announced that it was withdrawing from the grain deal. Russia has once again proven to be the curse that keeps on taking. We are back to square one. Global food security is once again under threat. Russia's justification for terminating the grain deal. I am unsurprised that Russia has decided to terminate the Black Sea grain deal. The deal was a miracle in the first place, considering the intensity of the conflict.
Threatening to walk away from the Black Sea grain deal unless some Western sanctions against his country are lifted. The deal brokered by Turkey and the United Nations has allowed ships to carry Ukrainian food exports from Black Sea ports since last summer. The change would affect millions of people across the globe who depend on the grain and other food products that come from Ukraine, which is a major supplier.
The Kremlin's justification for reneging on the agreement is that the other parties have not fulfilled some conditions, thus invalidating the deal. For months, the Kremlin has been warning that parties to the deal have failed to meet the stipulated conditions for it to extend the deal. Was it all along laying the groundwork to back out of the deal? To understand the reasons for the deal's termination, we have to look beyond the Kremlin's facade. It is not hard to decipher Russia's real intentions if you have been following the twists and turns of the war in the past year. There is no denying that Western sanctions have devastated Russia's economy. For instance, Russia has faced difficulties exporting its grain, fertilizers, and other agricultural products to world markets due to sanctions on its banks. The exemption of food and fertilizer exports from the sanctions has done little to alleviate the shipping hardships that Russia faces. It is, therefore, logical that Russia would demand the removal of the sanctions as a condition for renewing the grain deal. Then, what does the former KGB spy want to achieve? We can only speculate about it by analyzing the Kremlin's actions and statements since it nixed the grain deal. At the recent Russia-Africa summit held in St. Petersburg, Russia promised to supply African countries with tons of grain free of charge. Russia also pledged to write off the debts of African countries. In the summit, Putin made references to neocolonialism, which is a way of telling African leaders that Russia is a trusted friend of the developing world, unlike the West. Putin promised to help African countries free themselves from the chains of neocolonialism. Considering these moves, it is hard not to conclude that Russia is playing a geopolitical game with the West. The Kremlin knows very well developing countries will be most affected when food prices start rising again. There is no guarantee that Russian grain and fertilizer will be able to reach global markets unless the West lists the sanctions. The Kremlin knows very well that the West is unlikely to relax the sanctions unless it ends the war in Ukraine. If you understand Putin's playbook, you should expect Russia to pass the blame for food shortages experienced by drought-stricken African countries onto the West. In my opinion, Putin wants to play the global South against the global North. Is it a fair game considering the millions of lives at stake? I will leave you to decide, but at least you can see the game being played by Russia here. What makes the deal critical? Countries that have long grappled with the problem of food insecurity will be the biggest losers.
23 million tons of grain and other foods have been exported by Ukraine since last July. That's despite a brutal war that's massively impacted farming. A grain deal has at least got things moving. But whenever it needs to be renewed, Russia threatens to pull out. And experts warn that would have profound effects.
If the deal is not renewed, we would see significant impacts on global food prices and on global food security for millions of people around the world.
Russia has been increasing its spheres of influence in the Third World by championing itself as a true friend of developing countries. Does the termination of the grain agreement amount to a betrayal of Third World countries? Some people feel this is the case. One African top official has termed the move by Russia a stab in the back. You would also feel the same if you understood the significance of the deal to global food security. I will briefly explain why the uninterrupted exportation of Ukraine's agricultural produce matters and why the grain deal was a lifeline to many countries. If it were not for the war, Ukrainian agricultural production would be enough to feed more than 400 million people. Ukraine's food exports are more than enough to provide the entire United States with food. You might be interested in more statistics about Ukraine's agricultural sector. 10% of the wheat, 15% of corn, 13% of barley, and 50% of sunflower oil consumed worldwide is produced by Ukraine. The country also supplies. That is how crucial Ukraine is to global food security. Food prices have spiked since Russia terminated the deal. Tens of millions in countries with droughts are threatened with hunger and starvation. Hundreds of millions of consumers will pay the price of increased prices of food and essential commodities. It is no coincidence that Russia has chosen not to renew the agreement at the beginning of the Ukrainian harvest season. Putin thinks he has found the soft underbelly in his long-lasting feud with the West. Will he succeed? Will the move soften the West's support of Ukraine? Well, time will tell. the way forward. Even if another miracle happens and Russia agrees to renew the deal, I believe the outcome will be the same. Russia will still exit the agreement for whatever dubious justification it might give. Russia has not made it a secret that it wants to replace Ukraine as a major exporter of grain and other agricultural produce to the global south. As a result, the country has been revamping its agrarian sector in recent months. This shift could be informed by the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. Russia could take advantage of the exemption of its food exports from Western sanctions. However, this is easier said than done. The shipping challenges that Russia faces as a result of the sanctions won't end anytime soon. The pariah status that Russia has achieved since its invasion of Ukraine has made Western traders avoid dealing with Russian products, including grain and other food products. The implication is that it would be costly for Russia to export its agricultural produce.
But Russia's invasion meant exports all but stopped. The agreement to get Ukrainian foods moving again was brokered by Turkey and the UN last July. It guaranteed safe shipping routes via the Black Sea for hundreds of ships from Ukraine. After the vessels had been inspected in Istanbul, they travelled onwards, playing a crucial role in easing a global food crisis. But Russian President Vladimir Putin has used it to try to squeeze out concessions from the West.
As a result, the prices of exports from Russia will be higher than those from Ukraine. I conclude that it would be hard, if not difficult, for Russia to take over the Ukrainian global markets. Could the West relax its sanctions? From where I stand, this seems unlikely. Russia's aggression against Ukraine persists. As a result, the West will have no other option but to impose additional sanctions. There is also the question of China, which has been the biggest beneficiary of the Black Sea grain deal, along with other developed countries. About 24% of Ukraine's wartime grain exports are received by China, making the second largest economy the biggest beneficiary of Ukrainian grain exports. Will Beijing convince Moscow to renew the deal? So far, China has been silent about the renewal of the agreement. It is unclear if there are behind-the-scenes maneuvers to save the grain agreement spearheaded by China. The main question remains: what are the remedial measures to ensure Ukrainian grain reaches global markets? A lot is at stake if the supply stops. It is paramount to find a solution soon. What is Ukraine's plan B? Although there are alternative routes for Ukraine to export its grain through land and rail, the alternatives cannot accommodate the massive volume of grain that needs to be moved. Despite Russia's decision, Ukraine remains confident that it can continue using the Black Sea corridor. Ports along the Danube River could be viable options. These ports, along with roads and rail, have so far helped move approximately 36 million tons of Ukrainian grain. The United States has been at the center of its development in anticipation of Russia's permanent withdrawal from the grain deal. Another possible route is the Romanian port of Constanta, which is along the Black Sea. This route has so far shipped more than 3 million tons of grain from Ukraine to various markets. Further development of the Constanta port could help maximize its potential. All does not seem bleak for the exportation of Ukrainian agricultural produce. Efforts to develop alternative routes will ultimately pay off. However, suffering will continue in the short run unless Russia agrees to renew the grain deal or ends the war in Ukraine altogether. If you enjoyed watching this video and want to support the channel for more great content, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts on Russia's withdrawal from the grain agreement? Please let us know in the comments section below. Turn on notifications on this channel to get notified of our latest uploads. Follow this channel for insightful analysis of contemporary global events. Please click here to watch another video. Thanks for watching.